Hello, and thanks for tuning in. My name is Aaron J. French. I'm the editor of Dark Discoveries magazine, a magazine that explores dark fantasy and horror fiction, as well as metaphysical and esoteric themes. It's with great pleasure that I present the following interview with author and independent researcher Richard Smoley. This interview was conducted on the 24th of July, 2016, and it's featured in Dark Discoveries issue number 36. The theme of that issue is Radical Spirit. I want to thank Richard for taking the time to speak with Dark Discoveries, and let's start things off with the first question. So Richard, I was hoping you could tell us a little about your biography, both academically and spiritually. Dark Discoveries is primarily a writing magazine, so I think my readers would be interested in knowing how you got to edit such great magazines as Quest and Gnosis and how you got your start.
Okay. Well, my degrees are in classics and philosophy. And I was certainly drawn to spirituality, at an early age. I became interested in the Kabbalah when I was studying at Oxford and attended a group there in the late 70s. Eventually, I moved to California. I moved to San Francisco, and I got a job for several years working for a farm magazine, California Farmer, which is no longer published, but it was around for a long time. Around the time I was 30, I decided I would at least start looking into publications that were closer to my own real areas of interest. So I sent my resume around, and there were still a lot of magazines of that sort around at that time. And one person who contacted me was Jay Kinney, editor of Gnosis, or editor-in-chief. Well, he was at the time editor of Gnosis. And he had just started this magazine. I think I just bought the first cover at a metaphysical bookstore near where I lived. And it was in San Francisco. So I started writing book reviews for him. And a couple of years later, I started doing some editing work for him and eventually came in full-time as editor in very late 1990. And I did that for several years until early 99, as a matter of fact. And at that time, Gnosis was a magazine the subtitle was A Journal of the Western Inner Traditions, and it had different issues on various themes, ranging from things like Freemasonry, G.I. Gurdjieff, C.G. Jung, magic, Kabbalah, to Sufism. And all in all, 51 issues were published. It was a quarterly. Around late 98, it began to seem very difficult to continue with it. The financial side of things and the business side of things were starting to turn against small magazines in general. And a lot of them, particularly in the field of spirituality at that time, either closed, as Gnosis did, or they kind of went mainstream, so that you have things like Yoga Journal, which has survived, but Yoga Journal, as far as I can see, is not much more than a ladies' lifestyle magazine. And since ladies' lifestyle magazines have so much about yoga anyway, you can really wonder what the difference is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that was what happened with Gnosis. I moved back first to the East Coast. I lived in Brooklyn and in Massachusetts doing various freelance things. I started writing books. And in 2008, I moved to the Chicago area where the Theosophical Society is and began editing Quest, which is the house organ of the Theosophical Society in America. And that has a somewhat narrower focus because, it is, a members magazine. But, I do have a lot of general interest subjects in it, general interest themes. We did an issue on Islam in spring, which was very well received, essentially to we spread a little bit more actual knowledge about Islam and what it was about, as opposed to, a lot of, bites on media that may not reflect the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So, and then the current issue, which is the one that I just finished and is current now is healing. So, it's been very, very well received both by members and, outside readers, of whom there are a fairly small amount, because it goes to members. Anyone else can subscribe to Quest. It's not sold on newsstands, and you can subscribe, but we haven't really promoted it very vigorously outside the Theosophical Society network. And in it, the Theosophical Society network, every member gets it automatically.
Yeah.
So I've been doing that for 8 years.
Yeah, I read the Islam issue. That was a very interesting issue. I liked a lot of the articles in there.
Thank you. Well, the one who's influenced me most is Philip K. Dick, who wrote many, many works of science fiction, as you know, and he's in vogue now for various reasons. But he wrote 3 novels, Valis, The Divine Invasion, and The Transmigration of Timothy Archer, which were on specifically mystical Gnostic themes. And a Gnostic, Gnostic, is refers to an early kind of subset of Christians who believe that gnosis, a kind of inner awakening, was the key to salvation rather than the vicarious atonement of Jesus' death and so on. Mm-hmm. And Dick had some kind of vision in 1974 in which he himself felt that he had been part of this ancient Gnostic community, and it inspired those 3 novels, as well as a very, very, very long just a collection of notes, which he just called the Exegesis, which has been edited really quite thoroughly and conscientiously, and you can buy it today. It's called the Exegesis of Philip K. Dick. So he was certainly an important figure, and I can see he died, I believe, in 1982, and since that time, he's actually become much more of a central figure in pop culture. With any number of things being based on his books, from Blade Runner to the Adjustment Bureau on. So he's been an important influence. Mm-hmm. On a more personal level, my good friend John Shirley has written a number of intense books in that genre, and he even dedicated one novel called Demons to me. It's kind of cool to have a novel entitled Demons dedicated to you.
Yeah.
And he writes a wide range of things. One of his more recent books is called Doyle After Death, which is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle dies. Mm-hmm. The creator of Sherlock Holmes, he dies and goes to this kind of netherworld afterlife. And, this thing enables John to kind of explore themes about what the afterlife might be like. And it's a very compelling book. So those are 2, certainly going back, to when I was a teenager. Edgar Allan Poe was, certainly a striking figure. And, as with many people, a lot of his stories are simply poems, are simply kind of burned into the mind.
Yeah.
So those are some.
Cool. Yeah, we've had a couple stories from John in Dark Discoveries, so that's very cool that there's some cross connections there. He's a very good writer.
He is.
So let's talk about your book here. I have a copy of it. Your new book, How God Became God. So I'd like to know, just to begin with, what do you feel the current need is for a book like this? And what I mean is, what about current intellectual and social developments has called into question the notion of God, in your opinion, in the first place? And how can a book like this maybe fill the gap, or at least provide some information to explain to people the current situation at the time?
Well, a lot of this book is focused on the Bible, and one of its chief goals is very simply to do this. All right, well, you've heard that the Bible is not entirely literally true. Every educated person has heard this, and the vast majority of them believe it. Mm-hmm. But what parts are and aren't literally true is a subject of much more confusion. I mean, you go past Genesis and the flood. So, all right, well, what about the rest of it? Where does history begin and where does myth end? So one of the things about this book is to just summarize, a reasonably mainstream scholarly opinion about, well, is there any evidence for a figure named Moses? No, not from his own time. Everything supposedly written by him and about him is from centuries later. Jesus, is Jesus a historical figure? Most scholars would say he is. There are lots of things in the Gospels that he very likely didn't say or do. And there's an enormous amount of disagreement about which those things actually were. And it mostly has to do with scholars' preconceptions. I mean, if you're a hip kind of liberal, culturally creative professor or scholar, yeah, well, how your Jesus is going to be like this culturally creative, hip, liberal, progressive Jesus. Yeah. If you're, an old, fire-breathing reactionary, well, that's what you're going to find. Mm-hmm. Jesus is becoming a Rorschach blot.
Right.
So those are a couple of things, and the Bible has, in the United States in particular, really shaped our concept of God. There are lots of houses in the United States that have only one book, and it's the Bible. Whether people read it or not is, of course, another question. Mm-hmm. But that whole thing has been so important and so formative in our notion of God. It's worth looking at.
Yeah.
And, a lot of the other books, and there are any number of other books out there already on it, but they are rather vague and evasive with certain details. The famous book is Karen Armstrong's History of God,
right,
published about 25 years ago. Well, where does she start with? She starts with the God of Abraham. Well, that's all well and good. It is the case that the Jews, Christians, and Muslims all invoke Abraham as kind of a common spiritual ancestor. But one little fact kind of seems to get left out, which is the fact that no serious scholar believes that the Bible, the book of Genesis, says anything of any real substance or value about the historical Abraham, who supposedly lived around 1900 BC. Maybe his name. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to talk about the God of Abraham, you could do that, and there's a reason for doing it, but you really owe it to your public to make it clear that this has very likely little, if anything, to do with the historical Abraham, whoever he was. And that was kind of the kind of confusion and kind of vagueness I really attempted to clear up in this book.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it really fits a really nice public niche for people who, if you're in the scholarly profession, you would know about all this stuff, but then if you're just watching the mainstream news all the time, you would just see fundamentalism essentially most of the time. And so a person who would be more interested could pick up a book like this and really get kind of the lowdown. So I think that is a very useful thing to be out there in the bookstores for people. Yeah,
those biblical documentaries on TV aren't too honest either. Why? Right, because their audience is principally fundamentalist Christians. No TV producer is going to alienate his main audience. So although they purport to go into the history of the Bible, their actual facts are rather skimpy. Mm-hmm. For example, there was one I saw recently, which I mentioned in the book, about Herod and the thing about the destruction of he slaughtered all the babies in Bethlehem to get at Jesus. That's in Matthew's gospel. And this documentary said, was Herod psychologically capable of doing such a thing? And a lot is known about Herod outside of the Bible. He is a well-documented, important figure in his time. Well, yeah, he committed all kinds of atrocities. He killed his own son, so he's probably not really above something like that. The thing is that this documentary didn't point out is that few, if any, serious scholars believe that this slaughter of the innocents, as it's called, ever occurred. The only gospel that mentions it is Matthew's gospel. The other authors of the other gospels mention it not at all and know nothing about it. So a lot of this stuff is a little bit cagey.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. Let's see. There's a lot of material to cover, so I'm just going to see how much we can get through here. One other thing I was interested in, which is more towards the beginning of the book, is you talk about the importance of revelation and the eternal. And there's there's a lot of factual stuff in the book, but then there was very nice discussion of a kind of mystical uh, integration or a mystical approach to all this material. So could you maybe talk a little bit about revelation and the eternal? For instance, in Dark Discoveries, we sometimes think about writing as a form of revelation, even though it's typically you just think that you're imagining a story and you write it down and then you edit it and send it off. But I like to explore this idea that in itself is a kind of revelation, tapping into something higher, maybe. So I was wondering what you think about all this biblical writing, especially all the revelatory writing from the Old Testament, and maybe any correspondences or analogs with, with fiction writing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's there's a lot in that question. Now, revelation, in the sense that we're using it here right now, is some kind of direct experience of the divine. Now, actually, this is, I suggest, more common than people realize. For most people, it's actually rather fleeting. And since it doesn't resemble anything in the Bible or similar books, they just disregard it. But I think people do have some kind of experience of the eternal, however brief, momentary, fleeting it might be. And the prophets, past, present, and future, have had some kind of experience like that, which they chose to cast in, the kind of prophetic, poetic language. Now, here's the thing. There was this term used in the 19th century, which is still, in a way, kind of useful, which is called revealed religion. And revealed religion, is Judaism and Christianity, as revealed, in biblical times, by the prophets and by Jesus and so on. This is not what I'm talking about here, because all of that revealed religion, from our point of view, is completely secondhand or third-hand or 25th hand, right? It all happened a long time ago, and we're supposed to believe in it despite, historical evidence. That is revealed religion, and people are rather doubtful about it these days, for reasons including the ones I just said. When you're talking about personal revelation, a personal experience of the divine, this happens, and it's fairly common enough. There's no question about whether you're going to believe or not. You would be on your knees before you even thought about whether to believe or not. And that is genuine religious experience. And I suspect that many people have it, many more than we hear about, because, hey, the first thing you usually do if you have some experience like that is you're disturbed by it, you're frightened by it, and you conclude all too correctly that if you tell anybody about this, they're going to just think you're crazy.
Yeah.
So the people, the sanest people who have this kind of experience have very, very strong incentives. Just keep their mouths shut, and they do.
Yeah.
Which leads us, to believe it's completely uncommon and rare, but I don't think that's an accurate picture of the way it is.
Yeah, and you brought up Philip K. Dick, and he is an interesting example of someone that I like to think about, of perhaps having revelations, but then writing science fiction stories and the blurring of that line. Mm-hmm. He's definitely having personal revelations, but like the prophets of the Old Testament, this is seen as like revelation of the divine, a kind of a collective. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But if you look at Dick, he was even, when he writes what he was writing about, he did seem to talk to, project it onto the world and everyone else as well. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting line there.
Yeah. And, you could say, a lot of creative writing is inspired. It seems to come from some other source.
Yeah.
It's inspiration is kind of breathed into you, to use the etymology of that word. Mm-hmm. And it often does somehow seem quite other.
Yeah.
Dickens, when he was talking about his, characters and their, his characters multifold and very, very numerous. And he made some remark once. He said, sometimes they just won't leave me alone. So they had an almost quasi-independent existence. Mm-hmm. Here's a funny thing. Find it disturbing or not, as you will. There was a Russian mystic named Daniel Andreev who wrote his own version of the alternate worlds called The Rose of the World, which was published, you can get. And he said that writers are going to have to, in the afterlife, atone for the sins of their fictional characters. Dostoevsky was, when he was writing in the 50s, according to him, just about finished atoning for the sins of his various villains. Right. I find it interesting. I've never heard that anywhere else, but I think it's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, that's great. And I know from reading Notes from Underground in, undergraduate courses that, that definitely has an effect on the readers.
Yeah.
Okay, so you brought up Karen Armstrong's book and starting with the God of Abraham, but so in your book you begin before that. So let's talk about just Yahwism and how you present it in the book and how this monotheistic view of Yahweh, and I guess it's pre-Abraham, but I'll let you explain and how that really got going.
Yeah, well, Yahweh or Jehovah was the God of the Hebrews in the Old Testament. Where did he start out? Well, without going into the details of it, he may well have started out as a tribal deity of the Midianite League, a bunch of tribes in what's now northwestern Saudi Arabia. And somehow, someone who was connected with this, say Moses, and Moses is also a very, very shadowy figure, had some kind of experience of this God on Mount Sinai, which wasn't in the Sinai Peninsula, which is another story. And he gathered this group of people together, maybe very likely some escaped slaves, and they were bound. They were very, very disparate, but they were bound by this, shall we say, covenant to worship Yahweh. And they moved to the hill country of Palestine. Curiously, I guess where the West Bank is today, as it's called by some. And there's a big question about this whole thing. This happened, I don't know, say in the 13th century BC. Well, one thing that is not entirely clear is, well, this was a polytheistic culture. There was no monotheism as we know it. And lots of tribes and nations had their own gods that they were supposed to worship. And, it was really, not anyone else's business to worship that God or not. Well, Yahweh was this tribal God, first of the Midianites, who are mentioned in the Bible, and then of the Israelites. Now, way back when, was he only one of God, many gods that the Israelites believed in and served, or was he the only one, as the Bible tells us? We don't know, because everything is written from the point of view of the Bible's monotheists, they basically won the debate, and they created what we now know as Judaism. They also now created what is now known as the Old Testament. Many scholars believe that monotheism, that is, worship of one God and a belief in one God only, was preceded by something called henotheism, which is, well, you believe in many gods, but you only worship one. And many scholars believe that this is arguably how the religion of Israel came about. By the way, in Old Testament times, and we're talking about prior to the 6th century BC, Yahweh seemed to have a wife whose name was Asherah, who was a goddess. And this Asherah was worshipped right alongside Yahweh in Solomon's temple for most of the time that that temple stood. Right? This is from the Bible's point of view. Right. The authors of the Bible thought this was horrible and an abomination, and this was why the temple was destroyed. But that's only one point of view. Mm-hmm. So, and this feminine goddess, feminine god, got shunted to the side, but has never completely gone away.
Yeah, one of the questions that I brought up for me in your book, and you touch on this, is the feminine, the Shekinah, and is that where it was shunted to, do you think, or is that something different?
Yeah, in Judaism, the Shekinah,
yeah,
the presence of God.
Mm-hmm.
And this presence later became kind of personified as, a female figure, kind of an immanent God in the world, who, according to the Kabbalists, was exiled down here. Not perhaps coincidentally, just the way the Jews themselves were exiled. So that theme of exile is very, very strong in Judaism, I guess.
Yeah.
She took on other forms, and, in medieval Kabbalah being the mystical tradition of Judaism, she was personified as a figure called Matronit, which is in the Latin matrona, matron. Mm-hmm. Christianity did another take with it, with a Virgin Mary, who is, in a sense, kind of a descendant of this divine mother. But because of Christianity's own peculiarities, she had to be a virgin goddess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So how about the god El? In the book you mentioned that El was sort of conflated with Yahweh, and then the Shekinah was sort of put to the side. How did that... I'm interested in that, and I'm also interested in this kind of nationalistic angels, as you talked about. Mm-hmm. I mean, in some esoteric stuff I've read, it talks about, folk spirits, right? Or a certain people having, a cultural egregore or something like this. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in this idea of nationalistic angels and each tribe having an angel, and how all that got parsed out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, as I said earlier, there were these tribal gods, and El, mm-hmm. Was the high god, kind of the one god above everything. Most polytheistic religions have some version of this, although this high god is very, very remote and usually just can't be bothered, so you have to deal with some of the intermediary gods. This is true in Santeria, for example, where he's named Olodumare, and you can't really bother Olodumare because he's very old or he's lost interest in his creation or something, so you have to go through one of these other gods. Mm-hmm. In any case, El was the high god, and all these other gods, including Yahweh, were national gods. Hmm. They were the god, Yahweh was the god of Israel, so on, so on, so on. Now, in ways that we do not completely understand, around the 7th century BC, there arose this Yahweh alone movement, as it's sometimes called, in which all the other gods were denied as even existing, and El was identified with Yahweh. You see something in the Bible, it says, the Lord is God. Well, how incredibly boring. Yeah, the Lord is God. It means absolutely nothing. It's just a redundancy. Mm-hmm. But no, that's not what it says in the original. It's saying Yahweh is El, which at the time was a very radical statement. Yeah. The national God of Israel became the God of everything. Mm-hmm. Everybody else's gods were false. And Judaism transmitted this little idea to Christianity and Islam. And it is the source of much religious hatred, intolerance, bigotry, and fighting up to this very minute.
Yep. Live on the news right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. So and I was thinking about this a little bit, these angels, like in the Kabbalah, which you brought up, and even in some more esoteric traditions, there's this like invocation of all these different angels and attachment to different tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And I've listened to some. I'm interested in some of the fundamentalist viewpoints on this because it's interesting to see how because sometimes they seem to know more about this esoteric stuff than a lot of people claiming to be interested in esotericism.
Mm-hmm.
So they would view all this as kind of summoning demons but just calling them angels. But was there? But you're saying that in the Old Testament there definitely was like one, from what we know, a kind of angel assigned to each tribe, something like that.
And that idea survived of ruling angels. It's survived into the Kabbalah in medieval times, and there are references to ruling angels. And there was a famous Kabbalist in the 15th century, Pico della Mirandola, who, citing an old Kabbalistic idea, he said, no king is punished on earth unless his celestial militia are humiliated first. That is to say, there's a battle in heaven, and this is itself a long theme that you could talk a great deal about. And as a result of this battle in heaven, the king on earth is defeated.
That's interesting. So we talked a little bit about the consort. The only other question I had about that, which I think I'll save this for a later question, is about Jesus's consort. But I do have a question about Mary Magdalene, so I'll come to that one a little bit later. Mm-hmm. But let's transition from God to Jesus then, because you do that very nicely in your book. The first half focuses on the historical records of God and how much is factual versus how much is not known, and then you kind of go on into Jesus's life. And so I'm interested in the lost years, for one, is something I'm very interested in, but also adoptionism and the Essenes, and how much of that is factual and how much of that is just speculation. I know it's a big question, but
well, the lost years of Jesus are basically, at least according to the traditional gospel account, basically, his entire life until he was 30 years old. He was baptized by John. Oh, by the way, New Testament scholars do not believe in, the whole infancy nativity stories either, right? All of that is, considered to be mythical. So you really have nothing about Jesus until his public career, meaning that you can basically, as people do, make up anything you want about his non-public career. I think if you're going to talk about Jesus, I think you certainly have to, as many scholars do, this is a Jewish milieu. Jesus was a Jew. A lot of, there's a lot of Jewish influence. He was a practicing Jew as far as anyone could possibly tell. Yeah. What other influences were there on him? There are stories and legends that Jesus went to India and all that sort of thing. I don't know anything about that. It could have happened. People did travel those distances in those days. It's not, if you said Jesus went to North America, you would really be stretching it. There was a trade route from India, and they brought silks to Rome and so on. So, he could theoretically have. I mean, I don't see any real evidence for it. I'm willing to look at least a little closer to home in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is where Jesus lived. In his time, Greek influence was overwhelming. I mean, Romans were, the administrators, but culturally, they had no place in anything. Nobody spoke Latin except the Roman soldiers. Lots of people spoke Greek. It was Greek in that world was what English is becoming today. It's just the second language that everybody has. And there was Greek thought. And there were lots of different Greek philosophers and schools of philosophy. But there were also these wandering philosophers. And a lot of times they would teach in a way that was informal, conversational. It would be a lecture, but it would be kind of a popular lecture with some interaction with the audience. Horace, the poet, wrote a series of things that were meant to be like this. They were called the sermones. Why? Because the Latin word for this is sermo, where we get our word sermon from. They weren't sermons, in the sense that somebody's standing up on a pulpit. This is somebody talking in the market in imitation of Socrates. And it occurs to me that Jesus may well have picked up this style of discourse and possibly some of his ideas from these Greek philosophers who were there in his vicinity, at the time he was living. So you don't have to stretch too much to say that. Now, there is this group called the Essenes, and something is known about the Essenes because they are discussed in Josephus and the other historians of the time. They are not mentioned in the New Testament so far as we know. They were a semi-monastic sect, mostly celibate, who actually lived kind of like a Greek philosophical school, except they were hyper-observant Jews as well. They were not allowed to go to the bathroom on the Sabbath, which, I guess you could train yourself to do that if you absolutely had to. Now, they were hyper-observant of the Jewish law, as we just seen. Jesus does not have this hyper-observant attitude, if the Gospels give any clue whatsoever to what he was really like, which I think they do. He had a much more relaxed, casual attitude toward the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So while he was publicly teaching, he was not in a scene, or recognizably such. But he may have studied with them again in the lost years if he was celibate. And there are no records of discussions that are about Jesus having a wife that aren't centuries later. Well, he may have taken some kind of vow of celibacy while he was in a scene. And even though he kind of went his own way and did his own thing, he may have, chosen to keep that. Because, most Jewish men were, someplace between expected and forced to marry at a certain point. But the Essenes were an exception. And if Jesus was celibate, that could point to an Essene influence. The Essenes also taught a doctrine of heaven and hell, which sounds like what Jesus teaches in the New Testament. In the New Testament. Paul, the Apostle Paul is considered to be this hellfire-breathing villain. Paul never mentions hell, ever. But Jesus talks about it. Now, was this all put in his mouth later? Many scholars would say so, but maybe some of it actually just does go back to him. So his picture of the afterlife looks a lot like that of the Essenes. So it points at least a possibility that he was connected with the Essenes before his public career.
I find that very interesting, just the idea of that. And I've heard Jesus went to India one before, and of course, Jesus going to Britain is another one that I find pretty interesting. And you talked about him coming to North America. I think that's the Mormon one.
Yeah, that's kind of a stretch.
He went everywhere.
But if you take the picture I'm trying to give, we're talking about him in his own place, in his own time. These influences were there and were known to be there. So he doesn't have to have gone anywhere if much of what I'm saying is true. He may have traveled as well, but he wouldn't have to travel a hell of a lot of distance to pick up these influences.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And when I was in my undergraduate work, I had a scholar mentor who was a classicist, and he had been a missionary in China when he was younger, and now he was a classicist. He knew Greek and all this stuff, and he'd been studying all this biblical stuff and Greek philosophy, the pre-Socratics. And he said to me that he was almost certain that Jesus must have spoken Greek, or knew Greek, is what he thinks. I mean, he couldn't prove it, but he thought that.
I think that's true. And why? Well, lots of people spoke Greek in that place in that time. Also, here's a funny little thing. I didn't mention this in the book, but what was Jesus' name? To all appearances, from all evidence, his name was Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
This is a Greek version of the Hebrew Yeshua or Joshua. And you'll see a lot of people calling Jesus Yeshua or Joshua. Was that really his name? Well, we don't know. There's no evidence for that because guess what? A lot of Jews in Jesus' time had Greek versions of Hebrew names. That was what they had been named. So if that's so, his parents may have had more Greek influence than, they may not well have made, there's no necessarily evidence that they were, just these starving peasants, as everyone kind of tends to assume. They may have been, but they also may well not have been.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And Christos is just a title, so it's kind of like there's no identification person.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's see. So another part. So part of the magazine, we're looking at ideas of heresy is part of the theme, and I find heresies interesting. So you bring up adoptionism is one, and also just some, you call them faith communities, I guess is what scholars tend to call them. So what's the idea of the church then after Jesus is gone now, and some of these faith communities or heresies?
Well, there's a fairly wide scholarly consensus that there are these groups of Christians that grew up very, very soon after Jesus' time that looked to him as a spiritual figure, but had very, very different opinions about who he was. Some said that he was, a great teacher, but nonetheless a human.
Mm-hmm.
The Jewish Christians, called the Ebionites, seem to have been like this. There were others who said, well, Jesus was a son of God or the son of man, and we can get into what they thought that was. Right. All the Christians who wrote the New Testament just about had this theory, believed that Jesus was the incarnation of the Son of Man, who turns out to have been an angel,
right.
Yet again,
right.
Angels.
Mm-hmm.
But there is one theory that Jesus, he was kind of adopted as the Son of God at his baptism. Some scholars would even say the Gospel of Mark, this is what Mark himself believed. Mm-hmm. So Jesus wasn't born, as this angel, but he was kind of overshadowed by this angel. I believe you mentioned Rudolf Steiner, maybe in our conversation before the interview began. Rudolf Steiner believed something similar. He was an Austrian esotericist of the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm. In the adoptionism. Yeah. And so, let's see here. What about, so Docetism was another one you mentioned? What is
Which one?
Docetism, I think it's called, something like that?
Yeah, Docetism, I think it is. Yeah, well, that was the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
There were groups of Christians who, like certain Greek philosophers, thought the body was just like a loathsome sack of pus.
Mm-hmm.
The body itself was a defilement.
Mm-hmm.
Or in a prison, there's a famous line, I think it's in Plato, that says soma sema, which in Greek for the body is a tomb.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Docetists, insofar as we know anything about them, believed that Jesus was not really kind of a human being, but he was kind of a materialized form, that only appeared to be physical. Sometimes you will see, I believe there's a similar concept in Tibetan Buddhism where this figure is called a tulpa, kind of materialization. From the outside, you're probably not going to be able to tell the difference, but it has there's some ontological difference. He's not really a flesh and blood person, even though he looks like one. Mm-hmm. Some early Christians seem to believe that. Mm-hmm. Well, the Son of Man appears first in the literature in the book of Daniel, which was written around 165 BC. It's for various reasons, it's one of the biblical books that can be dated very precisely, few if any others can. And there is this apocalyptic vision in which the prophet sees someone, like he sees what he calls, a son of man, a human figure. Now, angels were often not only imagined as human figures, but in many cases in the Old Testament, angels are referred to as men, confusingly enough. But so this figure, the Son of Man, was kind of the great angel, the angel above all the other angels. The Kabbalists called him Metatron, a word of uncertain derivation. Philo, who's a Jewish philosopher who was contemporary with Jesus, calls this angel the archangel of many names. And some of these names were the Son of Man, the Son of God, the Logos, the Word, Wisdom. And that's who this angel was. Now, many of the early Christians, and probably practically all of the ones who wrote the New Testament, believe that Jesus was the incarnation of the Son of Man, whether he had been born that way, as Luke seems to imply, or whether he kind of overshadowed him at age 30, as Mark seems to imply. Opinions were not consistent on that. But they thought he was the Son of Man. And did he claim to be the Son of Man? Well, a lot of things we don't know, because a lot of these things hinge on the authenticity of certain statements that Jesus makes in the Gospels. The foxes have their lairs, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. That's in Luke. Well, if Jesus really said that, he's kind of hinting that he's the Son of Man. But scholars are very, very, they disagree a great deal about which of these things Jesus would have said and which of these things didn't. And guess what? It comes up to who their concept of Jesus was to begin with. You have this concept of Jesus, you whittle out things in the Gospels that don't agree with this, and by and George, there you have the historical Jesus. It's a totally circular argument. And that's a problem with a lot of New Testament scholarship.
Yeah. And yet the church picked up the idea seemingly and uses it, right? I mean, just on a
well, sort of. I mean, what happened was Jesus was this angel who was just below God, right? Philo said he was neither created nor uncreated, but he created everything. Yeah, this really sounds like the beginning of the Gospel of John. Well, the Christians believe that Jesus had been resurrected, and that after he was elevated to the right hand of God. That appears in the New Testament. So Jesus, starting out from a very, very high position, gets basically elevated to the status of virtual equality with God. And there was the doctrine of the Trinity. This only evolved. Nobody talked about the doctrine of the Trinity before the 2nd century AD. It is not known in the New Testament as is widely admitted. But gradually there was this Father and the Son, and there's a powerful need, a powerful truth about this concept of the sacred ternary. So they had to find the third, and I guess the Holy Spirit was as good as anything. So there you have it, the doctrine of the Trinity, as it evolved from Jesus' time to the Council of Nicaea. Well, to go back to the concept of the imagination, you could say that the imaginary takes two forms. One is that something that you just made up in your head, imagination.
Yeah.
And there was a French scholar named Henri Corbin who underscored this point, and he called the second kind of imagination perception of the imaginal world. That is to say, this is a non-earthly, non-physical reality, but it is an objective reality nonetheless, and it is, shall we say, cognized by higher faculties of perception. And you could argue that many of these things are, shall we say, imaginal creations, imaginal or pictures of the imaginal world. I think there is something to that, if only because so many of these imaginary worlds, these imaginary other worlds, bear a fairly strong resemblance to one another. They're certainly not identical, but there's a lot of overlap and cross resemblance, even when the two figures know of each other.
Sure.
Well, Revelation is, certainly partakes of that. It is, kind of an imaginal work. And, as a result, it's exercised enormous power over the human imagination, right? Boris Pasternak and Dr. Zhivago said that all great, genuine art resembles and continues the revelation of St. John. So that's pretty high praise coming from a major poet.
Yeah.
If you want to look at it in a somewhat more factual way, as it seems to have been conceived, although this is not exhausting the meaning of it, the guy who wrote Revelation, John, whichever John he was, seemed to think that there had been, guess what, a war in heaven. And this war in heaven was a purging of the heavenly realms. And how many heavenly realms were there? There were 7, associated with each of the planets as known at the time. So wait a minute. Suddenly this starts to make sense, because wait a minute, there's 7 seals that are on sale. There's this cosmic purgation that John seems to think, has gone on or is going on, culminating the devil being thrown down to earth. This happens in the middle of Revelation. And then all this stuff about the beasts and the whore of Babylon, in a sense, these beasts are these personifications of evil forces that have been thrown down to earth and pretty much wrapped up in a Roman Empire. The wicked city, she's the whore, she sits on 7 mountains. Yeah, Rome was built famously on 7 hills. That's among the more obvious pieces of symbolism in it. And the idea is that, there's going to be a final conflagration in which this beast is, killed and thrown into the pit, and then everything is great. He probably believed this was going to happen fairly soon, although it turns out that it didn't.
Yeah.
Not in that way.
Right.
Nero was pretty widely hated by just about everybody, and he was kind of considered kind of the epitome of the evil of the empire. I mean, eventually he was overthrown by the Romans themselves. So one popular theory is that his name in Hebrew letters adds up to 666. And that is the most likely interpretation if you want to put it in historical terms. You could go further into number symbolism because in Jewish thought, 6 is a number of completion. And Philo says this, as in the creation of the universe was done in 6 days. So this kind of 666 is sort of like, an indication this is sort of like, evil, cubed. That's most likely, most widely accepted explanation, but, you can go on the internet right this second and, Barack Obama is 666 and, Ronald Reagan was a popular choice and still is among some people. Hitler, Napoleon, all the usual suspects. Yeah. Well, the thing about it is that, these symbols are important and perennial because they point to, what C.G. Jung would call archetypal realities. And these archetypal realities manifest, if you're writing around 70 A.D., if you're a Jew writing around 70 A.D., this, wicked earthly power was going to be Rome. Today, you can, take your pick of wicked worldly powers. Some of the Muslim world seem to think it's the United States, and sometimes you can see exactly why they feel that way. But this idea of a wicked but all-pervasive earthly power, it's an idea that continues to exist because such things continue to exist. Because human nature, hasn't changed as much in 2,000 years as everybody likes to pretend. Yeah, well, I mean, the most famous, instance of that is the recent fragment called "The Gospel of Jesus' Wife," which, um, if I understand, scholarly views, is starting to look more and more like a forgery. That is, and even so, it's supposed to have been written at the 8th century AD, so this is way after Jesus' time. Now, in the Gospel of Philip, which I think goes, it's an apocryphal gospel, I think it was written in the 3rd century. There's this, and the Gospel of Philip is fragmentary. So, at one point it says Jesus, used to kiss Mary Magdalene frequently on her, we don't know, fell off the manuscript, but presumably mouth. And the apostles say, why don't you love us the way you love her? And he says, why don't I love you the way I love her? I mean, it's almost like a joke. And from this, people have gotten the idea that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' consort. I tend to be skeptical about it, although this, legend persists, and it's persisted, underground in Western Europe for a long, long time. One reason is, well, Jesus' family was revered after his own time. Who gets to be head of the church after Jesus, shall we say, disappears from the scene? James. Even his brother James. Why? Well, because he was Jesus' brother. James isn't even mentioned in the Gospels. He obviously took no interest in Jesus teaching while he was alive, but because the family was so venerated, he was made first head of the Christian church. He was the first pope. It wasn't Peter, so to speak. Well, by this theory, if Jesus' family was so revered, that certainly would have included his wife. And, there would have been some mention of her, in more or less contemporary texts, that is to say, in the New Testament. And there isn't. So that's one major reason that, people, most scholars don't think that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. But there are only two things that are known about her specifically from the New Testament. One is that Jesus cast 7 devils out of her. The other is that she was the first person to find that the tomb was empty. Those are the only 2 facts, if you want to call them facts, that are known about her. The 7 devils is interesting because it could mean, whenever you see the word 7, particularly in the literature of that time, you have to think about these 7 planetary powers. They were extraordinary. That was the way people thought the universe was, astronomically. So the idea that he had cast 7 devils out of her, these planetary rulers are sometimes considered to be evil, spiritual wickedness in high places, it's called in Ephesians. And so Jesus having cast these out of her would have meant that, she'd gone through, extreme level of purification, because to go beyond the level of the 7 is a very, very high level indeed. So, it wasn't like, was she some whore who was possessed by demons? Well, no, probably wasn't. It's, in a sense, it's sort of saying, or could well be saying that she was a very high initiate. And she is associated with Gnostic teachings of Jesus. And then you have to ask, I think should be asked, well, we talked about all these faith communities, right? Well, they probably go back to the disciples themselves who understood Jesus' message in very different ways, and he may have taught them differently according to their own capacities. Some, possibly including the Apostle Thomas and Mary Magdalene, were given a more mystical Gnostic teaching because probably because it was believed he believed that they could handle it. Others were given a kind of more exoteric teaching, presumably including Peter, because they weren't at that kind of level of depth or sophistication. And then all of this, then they all went out their own ways and these faith communities, and a couple of generations, they're all heaping accusations of heresy on one another. That would explain a lot about the early history of the Christian church, that is otherwise rather hard to sort out.
As your book shows, the more of a kind of, not a cesspool, but just a confusion of all sort of disparate elements all over the place. And really, there's a little bit of consensus among scholars here and there, but really a lot of it seems to be pretty, not quite fully known what was going on in a lot of cases. That seems to be my view from reading it.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is almost nothing is known of the disciples, particularly what happened to them after Jesus' time. Mm-hmm. They're mentioned in the book of Acts, which was written probably sometime between 70 and 90 AD. But even there, that book is mostly about Paul, who was a real historical figure. Right. You have his letters. Not all of the ones in the New Testament that are supposed to have been written by him were, but there are 7 that were. He's like the most solidly known historical figure in the New Testament, possibly in the whole Bible. But Acts talks mostly about him. Where the others went, whatever happened to them. There isn't even too much in Eusebius's church history, which was a fairly authoritative book written in the early 4th century, which collected a lot of earlier material, as much as Eusebius could collect. And, there was, he had access to a lot more than we do today. So, not so much about them even there. There are acts of various apostles, but, these are, very, very likely to be almost completely fiction. Some of them are like, almost adventure romance novels, which did exist in classical antiquity, that kind of thing. It's like
fan fiction, of Jesus or something. Yeah, that's very interesting. So, my final question that I wanted to touch on, and this is what I really liked about your book and why I liked the Inner Christianity book so much, is that, it's great to look at, the history and the archaeology, and people debate this stuff a lot. But what's really cool about your approach to these topics is this sort of mystical, practical, regardless of what is true and what isn't, you really help a reader pick out a mystical practice, you could say, from all of this, all this information that is simplified and, really profound at the same time. So maybe you could talk a little bit how you envision this in a more mystical sense.
Well, if you believe the Gospels, one of the most important things Jesus talked about was the kingdom of heaven, a.k.a. the kingdom of God. Now, even if you're like a conventional Christian, you believe that God himself came down on earth once, taught for 3 years only before dying in the ascension. So you would think that whatever this message would be that he was teaching in his 3 years would be something you'd really want to know about.
Yeah.
Well, hey, it turns out that scholarly consensus about this kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, is virtually non-existent.
Wow.
Look it up on Wikipedia. That's what it will say. Mm-hmm. But I want to suggest that the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God are refer to what I, in my books I call the true I, the true self, capital S self within. Mm-hmm. That in you which is conscious. Now, this is known to all religions. Why? Of course it is. Because if it's true, it has to be universally true. And any number of people, any number of religions, any number of parts of the world will discover it in their own ways. And they have, and they did. In in the New Testament, it is referred to in the Gospels as the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. Or in the Gospel of John, those are in the Synoptic Gospels, that's what it's called. In the Gospel of John, which is even more mystical, it is summed up in these I am statements, which I would suggest are not about Jesus personally or uniquely, but about the self that is within us. I am is the way, the truth, and the life. I am is, it's a seed that fell on the ground. It's the pearl. If you know, some people think it's like some apocalyptic kingdom, but it turns out if you actually took it that way, none of these parables make any sense. Absolutely none. But if you take it in this mystical sense, yeah, suddenly they become, even reasonably clear. Right. So, I think, this is important not only, to get, some understanding of what Jesus might actually have been saying, but, it's also the most important thing for us to know. Because, it's a treasure buried in a field. Right. Most of it, we all have it. You wouldn't exist. You would not cognize anything without it. But the vast majority of people, it's completely ignored, completely taken for granted. And, it's what is it like? It's like seed that fell by the wayside, right? It's the language of another parable. So I think that is the most, that's in a sense the most vital message of Christianity. And do all the other religions share this? Yes, they do. I'm discussing it in a Christian context for, as I said in the book, and it's true of how God became God in inner Christianity, because Christianity is the language, the religion of our civilization. It just is. You don't have to believe in God, but the God you won't believe in is the Christian God in the West. So it makes sense at least to try to make some kind of sense of this particular tradition, and remind ourselves that these eternal truths were stated in this language, which is going to be the most meaningful one to us because that's what we grew up with. Is it better than Judaism or Buddhism or Confucianism? I wouldn't necessarily say so, but it is ours. So, we better deal with it somehow.
Right, and in a way it's redeeming it. I feel a lot of people, because of some of the ways that Christianity has been used in this way, in one way or another, as a bad rap, So there is this like rehabilitation or reformation process, and sort of reclaiming, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Granted, a lot of stuff needs to go, and there's been a lot of problems, but I think it's cool to see authors like you trying to redeem some of it as being useful in the modern day.
And I think that core message is the most important. One of the ethical teachings, are equally important, but they're fairly clear. Like the sermon, everyone knows, has heard the Sermon on the Mount any number of times. And there, it's not a question of misunderstanding the ethical teachings; it's a question of not living up to them. And today, the world is literally stunned because, by George, the Pope actually seems to have read the Sermon on the Mount. This is unprecedented.
Yeah, it's funny. Well, I think we're about out of time, but I really appreciate you having taken this time to talk with us. And I was hoping maybe you could just tell our readers and viewers some of your other books that you've written, just if they're interested in exploring this material further, and any other books you have, and your website, where they can find you, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, my first book, co-written with Jay Kinney, was Hidden Wisdom, A Guide to the Western Inner Traditions. That's an overview of all of the things that Gnosis, the magazine, talked about. Right. Inner Christianity is a guide to the esoteric tradition expressed in the language of Christianity, which it can be, although it can be expressed in lots of other religious languages as well. Forbidden Faith is a history of Gnosticism, which we talked about a little bit, and how its influence is sort of, in a sense, stronger than ever today. Conscious Love, which is about, I've talked about some of these ideas. Well, how do they relate to love? Well, I'm not going to go into that now because we don't have time, but that book is about that. The Dice Game of Shiva, or Shiva, is about consciousness, how it creates the universe, so to speak. Everything has to have some element of consciousness in it, at least, in a primitive sense of being able to recognize and respond to the outside world, right? Mm-hmm. There's a chemical reaction. The chemicals have to recognize each other in some kind of primitive way before they react. Supernatural is a collection of some of my essays on more occult subjects, ranging from Atlantis to Freemasonry to A Course in Miracles. And The Deal, which was published about 3 years ago. 1 year ago, about 3 years ago, is a guide to forgiveness. It's kind of, it's the shortest and, in a way, simplest. It's like, well, your grievances are not doing you any good. They're ruining your life. Get rid of them. Forgiveness is in your own self-interest. My website is innerchristianity.com, and that inner, I-N-N-E-R, Christianity.com. But if you go to richardsmoley.com, it will just take you to the same site. So either of those will work. And I have a lot of things up on YouTube. There are audio versions of Inner Christianity, The Deal, and How God Became God, available through Audible and all the other sites. So there's a fair amount out there if you want to look into it.
Great. And so people can go and subscribe to Quest magazine if they like to, right? Even if they're not a member?
Yeah, you can just, I would say, if you're going to Google it, Google Quest and Theosophical, Theosophical. There are more than one, there are Quest magazine, so that will take you to the right one, Theosophical Society.
Right.
Or just Quest, my name, and they'll show you the site you get to.
Great. Thanks so much, Richard. Do you have any other things you'd like to comment on?
No, it's been a pleasure. The questions have been great, and I really enjoyed conversing with you.